Welcome to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show, and thank you for being with us. Our topic, leadership, focuses on leaders such as yourselves. We believe that leadership is a skill that can be learned through practice and awareness. It is our hope that our conversation will help you become more reflective when it comes to your own leadership practices and enable you to leave a positive legacy. Our very special guest is Dudley. Drew is an internationally acclaimed leadership speaker, author, and educator. As the founder and chief catalyst of Day One Leadership, Drew has worked with hundreds of the world's most successful organizations to help increase their leadership capacity. Drew's first book, This is Day One, A Practical Guide to Leadership That Matters, debuted on the Wall Street Journal's bestsellers list and has since gone on to become an international bestseller. Drew, welcome to the show.
Hey, Biana, it's amazing to be here.
Drew, I am very excited to have you on my show. You are a best-selling author of This is the Day One book, which I actually read, and I think it's an amazing book. We're going to talk more about the book, and also a speaker. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the book and about yourself.
Sure. The book was sort of born because of a group of students. I worked at the University of Toronto. I was running the leadership development program there, and I was surrounded by these exceptional students, and they would dedicate their time to extracurriculars, to not-for-profits, to social justice causes, and they were always doing things to support making the world better, as sort of trite as that might sound. And yet, when I talked about leadership within my workshops, what I discovered was most of them saw leadership as something they might be able to do one day. They, like I did for most of my youth, saw leadership as a relatively small club that not everyone can or should get into. And it was frustrating for me to look out there and see these dynamic and brilliant and driven young people not be willing to embrace the idea that they were, in fact, leaders. And ultimately, I discovered that most of my colleagues and other professors and administrators, and then people that I just knew out in the world, had the same challenge. And so the book was born out of that. Ultimately, my goal is to try to close the gap between the number of leaders in the world and the number of people who see themselves as leaders in the world, because there's a gap there. And I've realized that most of the leadership on the planet comes from people who do not think that they're leaders. And the idea of the book and the whole This is Day One concept is to, one, help people realize that much of the stuff they're doing already is leadership, and then two, to give them a starting point to be more conscious of that, to be more deliberate about that, and be more consistent in that.
So how do you define leadership?
For me, leadership is closing the gap between the person that you want to be and how you are actually behaving every day. And one of the truths I started to discover in life is that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, is almost always followed by a lie. What we do is when you say, I'm the type of person who always acts with integrity, I'm the type of person who is always trying to give more than I take. People who announce truths about themselves, you'll often find that they are in fact not true. And so there's that gap for all of us between who we want to be and how we want to behave and how we are actually behaving. And ultimately, some of us either deny the gap exists, but I think most people, what they do is they rationalize that gap. They say it's temporary. They say, as soon as I get through college or pay off my student loans or pay for the wedding or get the kids out of the house, always there's some big thing in our life that allows us to rationalize us keeping a gap between who we want to be and what we're actually doing. And so my concept is that leadership is finding a way to close that gap a little bit every day. It's engaging in behaviors that close the gap between who you want to be and how you're behaving, and not just every now and then. Because if you live your leadership, you live your values as a leader every now and then your leadership isn't a practice, it's a hobby. And I want to get people closing that gap as a practice, not just a hobby.
And, some people might not be even aware that they have a gap. They have blind spots.
Yeah, and I think that some people have complete blind spots, but what you'll often find more often is we know it's there, we're mildly uncomfortable with it, but we're telling ourselves that eventually we'll get around to it, but life constantly gets in the way. So I want people not to feel as if there's something wrong with them when that gap exists. But I don't know the key to happiness, but I do know that one of the foundations of unhappiness is when that gap exists and you become aware of it. And ultimately, we always know it's in the back of our heads, but we say, it's too hard to keep living up to things because it's so much easier to stand up for an ideal than it is to live up to one. So I think that is a truth for most of us. And I think if we can all accept that we're together on having that truth, then we don't quite feel as if there's something wrong with us.
And you know what I noticed? There is a strong attachment of kind of fearing to fail. So what do you say to these folks that are saying, I don't want to fail, so therefore I should not even try?
I think what happens is when we see changing our behavior in a major way, we see it as a big, long block of time. Let's say I want to live a healthier lifestyle. Success is if I'm 20 pounds lighter in 2 months. And that's intimidating. And so what I like to say to people, and this is the whole concept of day one, it says success isn't evaluated over big blocks of time. Success is evaluated on a single day at a time basis. And that's the concept of day one. In many ways, the idea of being afraid of failure is one that stops us all the time. But I think we have to remember that not starting something that we know will make our life better is a form of failure. And so that whole idea of breaking down success into single days allows you to be a little less intimidated, and it actually allows success to be a lot more likely. And it was really born from my personal experience quitting drinking. And one of the things I learned in recovery is all that you focus on is not having a drink today. And then you have to treat every day of the rest of your life as if it is your first day. Because on day one, there is an inherent commitment, there's an inherent humility, and there is an inherent forgiveness. Because if you mess up on your first day at anything, it's not that you're not worthy of the mission. It's that you screwed up on your first day, and everybody does that. And if you do something every day for 10, 20 years, none of that matters if you choose not to do it today. And so what I did is I broke down leadership in the same way. Let's look at it this way. Every single person on the planet, you and me and the Prime Minister of Canada, all of us got up today having accomplished the exact same number of leadership behaviors, 0. So we're all at the same level. All we do is focus today on saying, I'm going to behave in leadership ways. And my book and the work I do is about identifying your particular leadership behaviors that define your leadership and the series of the non-negotiable behaviors that will make up every day of this voyage. And it's how I engage in what I believe is leadership every day. I say, this is the non-negotiable of every single day.
So, Drew, are you telling us that staying in the moment and dealing with just what's in front of you is the leadership?
Yeah, it's not so much in the moment. It is about identifying what kind of moments you want to make up your day. I mean, if you count today as the moment, I'm not saying don't recognize that you're in the midst of a continuum of your life. What I'm saying is evaluate yourself as a person, not just on where you've made it so far in life, but by saying there are certain behaviors in which I will engage today. And here are the moments I will create today in order to feel successful. And what those moments are for you particularly is the focus of my work because they're a little different for everybody.
So let's talk about standards because we all have a different standards. How do you go about it if we all have so vast understanding what success is to begin with?
I think that the way I break it down is I say one of the best gifts you can give yourself is consistency in your decision making. Not everyone's going to like your decisions, but if you're consistent and transparent in how you choose to make them, I think there's going to be a respect generated there, even by people who don't like the decisions you make. And I think you can live with decisions that don't work out if you feel that they were made in a way that's consistent with your values. And so the way I say it is that one of the key things that we need to look at in our lives are what our values are. And I know that gets thrown around a lot. But ultimately, my work is about turning values into behavior because we use these value words all the time to evaluate ourselves and other people, and we don't really know what they mean, which means they're nothing more than window dressing for the most part. So what I help people do is figure out what their core leadership values are. And the reason you want to do that, besides the fact that it's been scientifically shown to be linked to higher levels of happiness and productivity and pride, is this. Your values are criteria for decision making. And so that means that every time you're faced with a decision, you hold the options available to you up next to your values, and you say which one of these options is most consistent with these values. That is impossible to do if you don't know what they are. And the other thing, too, is that you need to define what they mean. So if through your process that I take people through, let's say integrity, which is the most popular answer to give before they go through the process. But what is integrity? Anyone listening now, if someone walked up to you and said, I'm so sorry, English is not my first language, could you explain what integrity means in the simplest English terms possible and start your answer with the phrase, a commitment to? So integrity is a commitment to what?
I say commitment to your values.
Yeah. So integrity is a commitment to values. But what does a commitment to values mean? Is it a commitment to making decisions based on your values? Yeah, that's very specific. That's a behavior. When you say it's a commitment to, you need to make sure that specific behaviors are listed after that. So respect is a commitment to treating everyone as if they have inherent worth. So once you create this list of what your values are, make sure you can actually finish the sentence, a commitment to. Because if we do not identify the behaviors that define a value, if we effectively don't turn a value into a finish line so you can recognize when you cross it, most of the moments where you're living up to it, where you're being the person you want to be, are passing by unrecognized and uncelebrated by you. And my argument is that moments that embody these core values, things like courage and empowerment and self-respect, all of these moments are leadership. Not everybody can be CEO or president or has any interest in doing those things. But there is a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And it says, here are my values, here's what they mean, and then you use them as criteria for decision making. And if you are making decisions consistently by referencing the values you hope to define you, then that's leadership. And ultimately, good leaders do that. They identify their values and define what they mean so they can use them as criteria for decision making. Where great leaders separate from good leaders is that good leaders live their values whenever the opportunity presents itself. Great leaders create opportunities to live their values. So yeah, it's one thing to be generous when the opportunity presents itself. It's another to have a system in your life that says, I'm going to generate a moment of generosity today. And that's the fundamental sort of extra step in the work that I do. It says, okay, saying that you want to live up to generosity or impact or empowerment, yeah, the conscious effort to do it does help. But as we all know out there, consciously wanting to do something often isn't enough. Life will get in the way. So what we do is we leverage the power of a particular psychological effect, or two of them actually. And one is called the Zeigarnik effect, which says, okay, things on your to-do list that you have not yet completed take up a more prominent spot in your consciousness than things you have completed. But stuff you haven't done bugs you. And the second was called the question behavior effect. So if I ask you a series of questions in the morning about a particular behavior, what's the most generous thing you've ever seen? Who's the most generous person you know? What's the most generous thing that you've ever done? You are way more likely to engage in that type of behavior later in the day because you were asked questions about it than you would otherwise. And you won't even be aware of it. And so if unfinished tasks cause psychic discomfort until they're completed, and questions can drive behavior. And then the key to my work is to say, okay, on day one, you say, these are the values I want to live up to. Here's what they mean. And then the big trick, though, is you do what we call you operationalize that value. You change it from a commitment to a question that you can't answer without doing it. And so for impact, a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel better off for having interacted with you, we turned it into the question, what have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? A leader evaluates their values, defines what they are, and turns them into these questions. And the questions that are associated with your core values, that's your leadership test. That's your daily evaluation of your leadership. I have 6 questions, and every day I try to get 3 out of those 6 answered by the end of the day. And those 3 questions, I cannot answer them without living my core values. So even on the days where everything outside of my control blows up in my face, I can still say to myself, yeah, but I got 3 of my 6 questions today. I may have lost today in terms of the grander scheme of life, But you know what? I stayed true to who I was today. And that's a gift you can give yourself, because there'll be a lot of days where it's the only thing that you have.
But it's interesting because I actually had another guest that talked about split personality, where you have your core values, but you act differently in a different situation. So, for example, if you have a mean boss, you would be more withdrawn. So you would not share your contributions. Versus if you have a very good boss, then you would be contributing more. Do you have, what are your advice for that? Because sometimes you're in work situations that are just really not conducive to support your core values.
Well, I think that the idea of what I talk about is how do you find a way to get your core values into every day? There are some parts of your life where your values don't lend themselves easily to living them each day. And I think that's the challenge, is that let's say that you have a really bad boss and they ask you to do something that goes directly in the face of your values. The thing that's so hard is that often the option that is most consistent with your values sucks. It is not the one you want. It is not the one that avoids consequences. It is not the one that lets you remain in the job, take the money, or stay in the relationship. But it is always the decision you're happiest made 5 years from now. Like if we make every decision in our life as if we're looking back on it 5 years from now and telling a group of people we care about and respect how we handled it, a lot of the noise surrounding our decision-making falls away. So yeah, we say, oh, well, we adapt in different situations. But every time you compromise your values to make it a little bit easier or to avoid consequences, ultimately we give up a little bit of ourselves. And people say, well, that's complicated. It's not complicated. But what's complicated is living the values you want, being the person you want to be, and getting the stuff that you want. That's where the tension lies. And the thing is, 5 years from now, if your boss is horrible and you're miserable every day, you want to tell the story of how you quit and made your life better. That's the story you want to tell, but that's the story we don't have the courage to live. And when people are like, well, Drew, are you saying leadership is quitting my job? If your job sucks and your job makes you miserable every day, yeah, it's quitting your job. Well, how will I pay my mortgage? Basically, your salary is the fee they charge you to give up on your dreams sometimes. Your values really aren't supposed to be negotiable. And anytime you negotiate them, it's because it makes your life a little harder. And if you don't know what your values are, if you haven't defined them and you don't use them as criteria for decision making, my question to everyone is, what criteria have you been using to make decisions your whole life? And most of us are not aware that the primary criteria we use to make decisions in our lives is which option will avoid the most consequences right now. And we will keep doing that as a matter of survival until we consciously decide not to. And when our brain is busy and tired and stressed, it just defaults to what's easiest. And that's what we've known longest. And so that's what we default to. And my argument is that leadership starts to change that and just do it every day as if it's day one. And that's where we get the commitment to keep doing it.
And for that, you need courage. You actually in the book define confidence versus courage. And I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about it, because most people think it's one thing, but it's not.
Yeah, I find a lot of people resist the idea they can be a leader because they don't see themselves as confident. Confidence is acting like something doesn't scare you, which means that you can act confidently without ever having to do anything. It's just you act that way. Courage is acknowledging something scares you and taking action anyway. That's courage. And ultimately, most of us are capable of courage, even if we're not capable of acting like we're not scared. So confidence can exist without action. Courage only is generated through action. Action that you take when there is the possibility of loss. Because the fear that we feel about taking actions is because we're afraid of losing something. I think one of the ones I talk about in the book is the young man who introduced me. I've heard it many times since, but I had never heard it before. He said, my life is basically determined by how often I can answer the question, am I capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage right now? And he said, I never felt confident, but every now and then he could say to himself, am I capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage right now? And the thing is, all of us can answer that question, yes. We might not feel like we're capable of the courage it takes to handle 5 minutes from now or what might come about because of this tomorrow. But in any given instant, each one of us is capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage, which is to make the commitment to take action in the face of loss. It only takes 5 seconds to start it. And that, I think, is key. If you do not feel confident, it does not matter. True leadership is born in courageous acts. In every courageous act, there is the possibility of loss. But all of us can take 5 seconds and be willing to take that chance. And we'll often find that either we don't lose or the loss that happens is not as severe as we expected, and in many cases still gets us into a better place than we currently are.
And what advice do you have for folks who are really paralyzed by fear?
Incremental change. I think that that's the key, is that every challenge and every fear we have is generally the biggest fear that we can create in our minds, right? So we take a look and say, what's the worst that could happen? And then basically decide that that's how we're going to judge whether we have the guts to do it, whether or not we can handle the worst situation. And I think it's like anything else. If I tried to go out and run a marathon today, I'm a dead man. But if I run 5 minutes today, and look, I used to be 320 pounds, and the person who helped me lose weight told me 15 seconds of cardio a day, 15 more seconds, and start at 30 seconds. I was insulted. Like, 30 seconds of cardio? Are you kidding me? Like, how pathetic is that? And then at 320 pounds, I got on the elliptical, and 30 seconds was really difficult. But then 45 and a minute, and then, an hour straight. That took 15 seconds at a time. So if you're afraid, then don't worry about how you're going to get the last 10%. Worry about how you're going to get the first 2.
And what about the folks that are constantly listening to the noise from other folks?
Yeah, I think it is a natural part of being in a social world where the opinions of others impact us. But I also think that one of the reasons that we're so willing to hear negative things is that we haven't given ourselves a whole lot of evidence that we deserve better. And so the whole idea of the leadership test, like identifying your values and turning them into a series of questions, is that passing the test every night gives you evidence that you matter, gives you evidence that you're someone of worth. And I think that if we don't give ourselves evidence, we have no counterbalance to when people tell us that we're not worthwhile. Whether they do it directly or they do it indirectly or they don't say anything, we just look at their lives and say, oh, wow, that's better than mine. It's because we haven't bothered to give ourselves credit for who we are in quite a while. We just have this, oh, yeah, I'm a good person. But if every night you go home and you've got 6 questions or 4 questions you've answered, and in answering them, you really have lived something valuable that a lot of people on the planet didn't bother to think about, what you've done is you've given yourself evidence. So if you're paralyzed by fear, take one step. Am I capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage right now? And another thing, feel free to dismiss the judgments and the input of anyone who is not as happy as you are. A lot of the feedback we get are from people who are more miserable than we are. So give yourself some evidence, give yourself some questions, and dedicate yourself to those questions every day. And you're going to start giving yourself evidence that you have every right to dismiss other people's judgments.
And recognize that we are all leaders in our own rights.
Yeah, and I think that not just to play lip service to that, but to say, I am a leader, even though I don't feel like I've risen as high in the spectrum of financial compensation in the world as other people, or I don't have a title. Yeah, but how did you behave today? Most of the people that impact your life positively or negatively on a given day probably don't have leadership titles. But that person who makes you laugh every morning at the coffee shop, that person who makes your kid feel safe when he gets on the bus. These are the people who have the biggest impact on your life daily and your mood. And every one of them, how they make you feel is a result of the decision of their leadership. Make the decision that yours is going to make the interactions you have every day more meaningful for you and other people. Because an awful lot of what we choose to do every day, like the individual moments, are not particularly meaningful because we're not consciously trying to make them so.
Any final thoughts?
Start. I think that's the big piece, is that we need to start. And someone taught me a little exercise. He said, Drew, I got some questions for you. Can you name me the last 5 winners of the Pulitzer Prize for Literature? Can you give me the last 5 winners of the Nobel Peace Prize? Can you give me the last 5 winners of the Best Actress Oscar? And most of us can't do that. And yet, those people are at the very people that we strive to be, but nobody knows who the hell they are because their actions, despite being the ones that we think define success, matter relatively little to you. But can you tell me the name of a friend who got you through a time you didn't think you could get through? Can you tell me the name of a teacher who fundamentally changed the way you thought and how you learned? Those are the names we know. So why are they dismissed as less important in this world and as less of someone to aspire to as that first group of people? And not only think about them, but realize how you can be that person for other people. That is a lot more relevant to you. It is a lot more possible to you. And it's not a smaller version of leadership. It's bigger because it matters to you and it matters to the people around you. And who gets on the red carpet has zero damn impact on your life. So stop evaluating your life compared to theirs and start to realize the people who mattered in your life did not do things that you're not capable of doing as well. Now be conscious about doing them for other people the same way people did them for you.
That's wonderful. So how can people contact you, invite you to speak?
Yeah, drewdudley.com, DREWDUDLEY.com is basically the portal to everything Drew Dudley. So there's speeches that I've given and information on if you'd like me to come and speak at your event and talk about this new idea of leadership and more specifically have your crowd go out knowing a new process that they can apply. If you want to find out, the book is linked there as well as if you're not so much of a reader and you'd rather sort of consume the process and the lessons in short 5-minute video bursts. There's also an online program that walks you through how to create your own leadership test by servicing your values and allows you to sort of get started that way, as well as a leadership test that you could use today that's already created. So all that's on drewdudley.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Drew, for being a guest.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me. I love talking about these ideas, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
And it's always an honor to have people ask me to share them.
Thank you so much.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Our very special guest was Drew Dudley, an internationally acclaimed leadership speaker, author, and educator. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show. Remember that you're all leaders in your own rights, and the impact that you're meant to achieve starts with small acts of kindness, curiosity, and generosity. Please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you again, and until next time.